Now let's look at trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. Injuries on the battlefield became much more horrific with the introduction of cannons. The Chinese invented gunpowder as well as the cannon. You can see that on the two images on the left. But it was the Arabs, the Ottoman Turks in particular, who brought large cannons to the battlefield in the 1400s. And this struck fear into the hearts of many European armies, as you can see down below. It says the Arabs threw many iron balls launched with thunder. The Christians were very afraid of, as any member of the body hit was severed as if with a knife, and the wounded man died afterwards because no surgery could heal him, in part because the balls were hot as fire, and a part of that because powders used were of such a nature that any ulcer done meant the death of the injured man. And he was hit with a ball of thunder in the arm, and the arm was cut off, and he died the next day, and the same happened to all of those injured by the thunder. Even now the story is being told among the host. And throughout the 15th, 16th, 17th century, it was sometimes noted that men were found dead on the battlefield even though they had no outward injury. The shock wave of the cannonball was enough to destroy internal organs. And the psychological trauma of being involved in such high-level combat also began to be particularly noticed in the First World War.
During the First World War, a new condition emerged that caught the military and medical establishment completely off guard. There was no telling who would be affected by it or why. Those who suffered from it might be hypnotized or electrocuted, arrested or shot, all for the same illness. So many men were lost to it, there would be a revolution in military attitudes and a new field of medicine created. The condition was called shell shock.
These are the men whose minds the dead have ravished. Memory fingers in their hair of murders, multitudinous murders they once witnessed.
And in the First World War, the kinds of physical injuries from high-intensity artillery were also quite horrific, although surgical technique had advanced to the point that people were surviving. And indeed, changing attitudes about the physically handicapped began to adjust as a result of there being so many wounded children, as soldiers. Nonetheless, the issue of dealing with post-traumatic from combat remains a very serious issue, and this recent issue of the National Geographic talks about dealing with both brain injury and post-traumatic stress syndrome in veterans of the most recent conflicts. And of course, as we speak, we're seeing the horrific conflict unfold in Ukraine. When there is a blast that involves the head, there's generally a shock wave that moves throughout the entire brain, as shown below, and this will result in severe damage to white matter, as shown on the right compared to the left, basically a tearing and excess edema that is associated with a large amount of cognitive impairment. Now, increasingly, PTSD occurs in all sorts of trauma, not just warfare. The broad model of PTSD looks first at pre-trauma factors, gender, IQ, genetics, and early trauma exposure. People who've been exposed to trauma as children are going to have a much different outcome from people who've generally had an uneventful childhood and are first exposed to trauma during adulthood. Of course, the peri-trauma factors are very important, as is the post-trauma factors, which revolve around ongoing stress, the social support, and the degree of traumatic brain injury that the initial trauma imposed. But it gets confusing, as you'll see in a moment, because you don't have to have physical trauma to the brain in order to show evidence of brain injury. In other words, the kinds of neuroimaging findings that we see even in people who've only had emotional trauma tend to parallel those seen in individuals who've been exposed to physical trauma. Now, first, let's look at the genetics of PTSD. Of course, there's an overlap with the genetics of affective and anxiety disorders, but some specific genes have been looked at. That is shown in this figure from our recent review article. It actually is a very nice, concise description of biological factors in PTSD. The references in the upper left. There's a number of genes involved. You'll recognize some of these, particularly BDNF, which we discussed in the last lecture, which is related to increased thickness of the DLPFC. The COMT, which breaks down norepinephrine and serotonin, is related to reduction of hippocampal volume in PTSD. And one in particular that I'm going to focus on in the next few slides is FKBP5. This has a number of effects, one of which is to alter the shape of the hippocampus. And we've talked in prior lectures about the role of the hippocampus in the stress response, but also has profound effects on the HPA axis. Now, there are certain individuals who have a variant in FKBP5, and if these people have the risk variant, which is in red on the line in the graph, and they are exposed to child abuse, they are much more likely to develop PTSD. You can see that in the figure on the left. But also the figure on the right shows that they have much stronger amygdaloid activation if they are exposed to stressful stimuli in the scanner. So that suggests that having this particular variant in FKBP5 is one of the predisposing factors around this issue. There's a YouTube link there if you want to hear more about these particular studies.
So there have been a number of studies, and one of the best understood.
Now, this is a very complex graph, so let me walk you through it. This shows how the risk variant of the FKBP is involved. So here, down here, the light yellow circles are the complexes with the FBP5 gene, and the orange are the circles are the protein, which is the B4. Over in the glucocorticoid receptor, which are these large ovals, you will notice the red here indicates when they have the risk allele for the FKB gene. The white indicates when they have the normal allele. So here we have cortisol, here in A, it enters. It binds to the glucocorticoid receptor, which itself is bound to something called the heat shock protein. And here you see the FKBP5 linked here. Now, once the cortisol links, normally what occurs is that there's an exchange with the 4 attaching. That then enters the cell, and the normal pathway is to activate transcription, but also to produce MNRA, which is ultimately going to produce the BP4, the FKBP5 protein. And you'll notice in the non-risk allele, only a modest amount of the BP5 is produced. In contrast, for the people who have a risk allele, they have a lack of methylation here. Remember that methylation of the DNA shuts down the gene. So with the gene not being shut down, we get excessive production of the BP5 protein, MNRAs, which leads to increased BP5 here. These will lead to HPA dysregulation, so that the HPA now is overreactive to stress, but it also produces a number of other negative neurological effects. It increases the amount of toxic tau, thus people with PTSD are more prone to dementia, increases cell death, and increases a number of negative pathways that have adverse effects on neurogenesis. And this probably explains why we see decreased hippocampal volume in people with PTSD. This is the textual description that I just went through. Now, what we have here is, here we're looking at the BP5 expression. For people that have the low risk gene, we're getting, again, just a small amount of gene expression. For people with the high risk gene, you get a large amount of gene expression. When healthy people are stressed, there's negative feedback so that the cortisol response is dappered down, whereas there's impaired positive feedback in the people with the risk allele. This leads to a number of changes in the brain that are negative, and these are all listed here, where we get the so-called disinhibition subtype, people having an exaggerated stress response to subsequent signals in the environment. Here again is the textual description of what I just said with the reference for that journal. Now, if we look at neuroimaging studies of gray matter volume, what you see here is the orange is where there is significant difference between the groups. The negative numbers, of course, meaning that there is less gray matter. And you can see that at the top there's less total brain size, less total intracranial volume, and this tends to be predominates in the insula, which we discussed in the last lecture, in the temporal gyrus, in the anterior cingulate, in the orbital frontal areas, as well as in the hippocampus. So all of the areas that are critical in the regulation of emotion have decreased volume in PTSD relative to controls. And when we look at a particular pronounced area is in the medial prefrontal cortex, which is a key node of the default mode network involved in internalizing and mentalizing, and also in the subjunal genius, which is also involved of the rostral anterior cingulate gyrus, which is also involved in major depression, again, as we saw in the last lecture, probably explaining the high degree of comorbidity between PTSD and MDD. Now, let's take a step back and look at the role of adverse childhood experience. In this classic study, they looked at over 13,000 adults in a large HMO, 9,500 responded, and they asked them about the various psychological and physical stressors. And they found that these ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, were related to a variety of negative physical and mental health outcomes. And of course, this was all based on the retrospective recall of the patients. And the prevalence of these different stressors was quite high. Quite astonishing to me, at any rate, was the very high rate of people reporting sexual abuse, with almost 7% of the sample said that they had had intercourse as a minor that they perceived as negative. There was a very high association between the number of ACEs, more than 4 is the blue bar. Not surprising that this is associated with depression and suicide, but it was also associated with use of illegal drugs, smoking, and other physical diseases, liver and heart disease, as you can see. People with high rates of ACEs had lower cognitive ability, already had an abnormal cortisol response, reduced telomere length, obesity, severity of asthma, sleep issues, as well as indications that there were changes in their immune response. It is clear that there are complex long-term effects of trauma. We saw in earlier lectures that the mother-infant, parent-child interactions are critical to brain development in biological terms. So it's not surprising we'll see effects of ACEs on brain structure and functions. We'll probably see epigenetic effects where the early trauma results in changes in gene expression, and ultimately this will affect the HPA axis. Again, this is a review from the rat study I showed you. Rats that did not get adequate maternal care showed exaggerated levels of plasma ACTH and cortisone, and this was due to the experience, lacking the experience specifically, not due to any genetic variation in the mouse. And in a way that we rarely see in psychiatry, that there's a very close correlation between these animal findings and what we see in humans. So in this study, they looked at women with a history of child abuse, which they defined as early life stress, ELS, and they had them come into the lab and do a stressful task, which wasn't related to, they weren't asking them to repeat any information about their past abuse. They just did a cognitively stressful task. And what you can see is that particularly those with early life stress and concurrent major depressive disorder had very high rates of ACTH, cortisol, and heart rate, much the way that these neglected rats had. Now, we've talked about the amygdala as being critical in threat and assessment of biological significance. We've talked about the hippocampus being critical in memory and assessment of social significance. So this particular review looked at a meta-analysis of magnetic resonance imaging studies in adults who had childhood PTSD, and they looked at both amygdala and hippocampus. Here is the effect size relative to controls. So the higher up the bar, the greater the reduction in the volume of the amygdala and the hippocampus, and you can see that there are obviously bilateral effects in both structures. Then if we correlate the magnitude of the childhood abuse, that's the childhood trauma score on the x-axis, with the volume of the hippocampus, you can see that there is a very statistically significant a negative correlation that's very much linked to the hippocampus, as you can see in the colors there. The brighter the red, the lower the volume. And conversely, if we look at the responsiveness of the amygdala to threatening stimuli, we once again see that the higher childhood trauma score correlates with higher activation. Interestingly, we see it on the right side. Remember from the higher cognitive functioning lecture, we talked right is fright, that the right hemisphere tends to be more likely in processing stimuli that would cause us to withdraw or feel more negatively. Now, trauma has effects on neuropsychology. So in this study, they looked at trauma-exposed children, 300 children with PTSD, those who were trauma-exposed without PTSD, and kids who had no had no trauma at all. They were trauma naive. And importantly in this study, this was only familial maltreatment, and they ruled out anybody who had actual physical traumatic brain injury. And when they looked at the kids with PTSD versus controls, they found deficits across all of these neuropsychological measures. So the higher up the bar, the greater the effect size, that is more impairment relative to controls. And this is pretty striking. Effects on IQ, as well as all of these individual neuropsychological functions. When they looked at the traumatized kids who did not have PTSD, they did find effects. They had slightly lower IQs and slightly less impairment in visual spatial, not significant for the other measures, but it was clearly the trauma plus the PTSD that in turn caused impairment. Now we might ask, was the neuropsychological factor a risk factor? That is, those with lower IQ were more prone to develop PTSD, or did the PTSD, through its damage on brain, cause the neuropsychological deficit? That has to be explored by more prospective studies. Now, there are a number of early stresses that correlate with emotional regulation via functional MRI. So we look at poverty, we find that lower income is associated with diminished amygdala prefrontal cortex connectivity. Maltreatment also has a number of changes in disconnecting the amygdala from the prefrontal cortex. And of course, if the prefrontal cortex cannot regulate the amygdala, then the individual is more likely to be prone to maladaptive emotional responses. Again, this should be consistent with what we learned about in the affective anxiety disorder lecture. Trauma also has effect on the brain's reward system. Poverty leads to increased ventral striatum, PFC connectivity, also to increased salience network amygdala connectivity, decreased VTA hippocampus connectivity, and more positive ventral striatum medial prefrontal cortex connectivity. So this is altering the way traumatized individuals respond to rewarding stimuli, and I'll talk about some of the complex ways it does that in just a moment. And here it is. So Hertzberg put together this somewhat complex model. Now, you have to listen, follow along carefully, because you need to wrap your mind around this a bit. So on the y-axis, he is looking at the maturity of the functional connectivity of both the emotion system and the reward system. The reward system is going to be the salience network, VTA, ventral tegmental area, ventral striatum. The emotion system is going to be the hippocampal default mode network systems. So let's look at the dotted lines, which are no early life stress. So typically the reward system matures as we get into adulthood, and as does the emotion system. And typically we will, the emotion system is maturing sort of in a parallel way with the reward system. Now what Hertzberg suggests that the early trauma does is that it accelerates the maturity of these systems. So in the solid lines, you can see that the reward system is becoming more mature very early, as does the emotion system. And they are somewhat out of whack with each other. So this system is plateauing, whereas this system is continuing to mature. Thus, people fail to regulate both their general emotions, putting events in the world in context and getting the appropriate emotional response, and their response to reward is also, excessively mature. Now, recently, this study just came out in the American Journal of Psychiatry, well, recent by 2021. They're looking at 3 groups of individuals, typically developing adolescents, resilient, which are kids with trauma who did not develop PTSD, and susceptible, those who already have significant PTSD symptoms. And you will see here that the IQ in the people with PTSD is already significantly lower than that who are resilient. If we look at the mood and feeling questionnaire, which is a depression questionnaire, obviously the susceptible are more depressed. They have higher levels of anxiety, that's the scared, and they have higher levels of PTSD symptoms. Now, what they've done is looked at the maturity of the brain as opposed to looking at gray matter pruning. And when they looked at the whole brain, that's figure A here, there's no difference between the three groups. But when they look at the hippocampus and other areas of the brain that are involved in emotion, you can see that both of the groups here who've been exposed to trauma have decreased or have somewhat decreased brain maturity relative to the typically developing, kind of the not entirely consistent with Hertzberg's hypothesis. And hyperarousal symptoms are less, the more hyperaroused you are, the less mature your brain is. So how do they sort this all out? Well, what they found is that the reason their overall results were a little bit weak is because there were certain areas of the brain that had delayed maturity and certain had areas that had advanced maturity. So here we look at the resilience individuals. There's advanced maturity in the hippocampal regions and less so in those who were susceptible. But they still had advanced maturity, particularly in amygdaloid areas. All right. So now let's shift our focus from the gray matter itself to connectivity between different brain regions. And here we see a separate study that looks at the relationship of negative parenting, not necessarily abuse, just very negative parenting, and its effect on connectivity between various brain regions. So each little graph here is a brain region. So up here on top we have right amygdala and the precuneus and cingulate gyrus. Here it is right here, or the precentral gyrus, excuse me. You can see that the more negative parent, the less connectivity. Same with right amygdala and superior temporal gyrus, left amygdala and the MOG and occipital area. The one exception to that is the left amygdala to the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, actually somewhat less more connectivity if there's more negative parenting. So the wiring of these different regions being connected to each other is clearly altered here. And in this review that came out in Current Psychiatry Reports, they kind of put these three major networks that we've discussed together. So we have up here is the salience network. And what they're saying is that in people with PTSD, there is increased intrinsic connectivity. These three regions are more highly connected with each other, and that is related to heightened threat detection. The central executive network also has decreased intrinsic connectivity, which suggests more cognitive deficits and loss of top-down regulation of mood. Then finally, in the default mode network, again, decreased intrinsic connectivity, less connectivity between the nodes, and this leads to disruptive internal mentation and altered sense of self and fear generalization or avoidance. And then finally, as you can see by the dotted lines, there's less inter-network connectivity. Remember that the salience network is important in maintaining the normal anti-correlation of the default mode network and the central node network. And as we saw in ADHD, this maintenance of this anti-correlation is impaired. Well, what's another diagnosis that makes people prone to PTSD? Well, believe it or not, it is ADHD. Trauma does not cause ADHD, but rather the reverse. ADHD is one of the pre-existing factors that makes you vulnerable to PTSD. And we're seeing similar types of disturbances in the connectivity. Now, once people have developed PTSD, they have a tendency to put themselves in situations where they're re-traumatized. We certainly see this in the relationship era, where individuals who've been abused tend to end up with a partner who repeats the abuse. Now, again, we've talked about reward prediction error, that when you see something happens that is unexpected, particularly if something good does not appear, then you get a reduction in dopamine input to the ventral striatum. So Ross and his colleagues did a learning reversal paradigm with adult women with and without PTSD, and they had to unlearn a prior response. Now, when you have to unlearn the response, in other words, what you're doing is not working, and therefore you need to change your response, then when you get the sense that things aren't worsening, you should generate a reward prediction error. And what he found here, in quotes, women in the PTSD group demonstrated significantly less neural encoding of prediction errors in both the ventral striatum and medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior insula. Weakened encoding of prediction errors in the ventral striatum and anterior insula during a general reinforcement learning task outside the context of fear stimuli suggests the possibility of a broader conceptualization of learning differences in PTSD than the current proposed neurocircuitry models. So what he's seeing here is these bars represent in the scanner the increased, in the ventral striatum, increased reward prediction error in the controlled individuals relative to the PTSD. Now, fortunately, our principal treatment of PTSD, that is trauma-focused CBT, appears to have a strong possibility of reversing these neurological deficits. So Amy Garrett, who's here at our facility at the Research Imaging Center and in the Department of Psychiatry, she did a study with 20 adolescents with PTSD and 20 healthy controls. They were both scanned twice, 5 months apart, and the PTSD subjects underwent trauma-focused CBT. And the question is, what effects did this have on the brain? Well, you can see that in the green, the controls, there's no change in the activation to neutral faces. But for the people with PTSD, you can see that they have decreased activation in the right hippocampus as well as the left hippocampus, and that decrease correlated with greater improvement in symptoms of PTSD, and in particular symptoms of dissociation. They also found changes in the medial prefrontal cortex as well as the lateral orbital areas. The blue, again, is the PTSD subjects. You can see they're very different from controls at baseline, and they're much more like the controls by the end of the course of PTSD. And the therapy is affecting exactly the areas we would expect from the baseline data. That is amygdala, hippocampus, medial prefrontal cortex, all areas that are involved in processing these negative emotions. This just gives us that the activation here in the posterior medial prefrontal cortex changes with the study, it decreases, and the greater the symptom improvement, the greater it correlates very nicely with the decrease in that activation. And that concludes our discussion of PTSD.